Okay, so we will make a start as it is 7 o'clock. Welcome everyone to Unions Renewed Building Power in an Age of Finance with Alice Martin. This is now the third session in the JFTU Educational Trust's strategy series, and we hope you'll sign up to the other fantastic sessions in the series that are all free to everyone. Tonight follows our session with Joe Burns a few weeks ago on reviving our movement, which is available on our YouTube channel. And this is what the series is about if it's your first time here. Strategy is not just a word. Strategy is about how well we all within the trade union and wider labour movement build the power and capacity to improve workers' lives. The employers have a strategy, the managers have a strategy, and it is absolutely vital that as a united labour movement, we build and have our own. This series will include discussions from leading thinkers on reviving the trade union movement, how we build union strategy, the role of women and feminist approaches to our unions, strategies for developing activists, and the capacity to win campaigns, both big and small. At the JFTU Educational Trust, we believe in radical independent trade union education for the whole movement, and through events like this, free to all, we hope to make that as accessible as possible. So if you can, please consider donating to the Trust or becoming a friend like I am. The links will be in the chat. This session is being recorded and is broadcast live on social media. How the call will work is it's a webinar, which means you can see myself, and I haven't introduced myself. I'm Sarah Woolley, the General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, and also the President of the General Federation of Trade Unions. So you'll be able to see me and Alice, but you're not going to be able to see each other. Feel free to ask us questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll ask Alice your questions directly after she's done her fantastic presentation. Alice is going to speak to us for 30 minutes maximum, give or take a few, and then we'll move into questions. We want to remind you all at this time that during the call we'll be following the JFTU Educational Trust Behaviour Statement. The link should be in the chat now. And if you do have any concerns, please read and follow that policy. So I am delighted, absolutely delighted. This is one of the perks of being the president of the GFTU, being able to do stuff like this. I'm delighted to introduce Alice Martin. Alice is the co-author of Unions Renewed, Building Power in an Age of Finance, politely, along with Annie Quick. She has over a decade of experience researching workforce topics with a focus on insecure forms of work, worker voice, and employer conduct. She's currently the head of research at the Work Foundation, Lancaster University, and previously worked as a specialist advisor to financial sector audiences on employment rights and industrial relations. Prior to this, Alice was head of work and pay at the New Economics Foundation, where she co-authored publications on the gig economy, working time, and economic inequality. And I don't know about you, but I am so excited to hear what Alice has got to say. So Alice, without any further ado, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was a brilliant introduction. Thank you. And it's nice to be reminded of things I've done. I haven't actually taken the time to think about that for a while, so that was really lovely. So I feel really honoured to be invited to give this talk and hopefully have a conversation about some of the things that I raise, because I think there will be people in the call that have their own insights as well on some of this. So it's really funny because when the book launched, it was around the kind of pandemic time, and we'd actually just entered the first lockdown. So I really didn't do much speaking about it at all, nor did my co-author Annie. And she was sadly actually impacted by long COVID. So she's had to really limit the amount of sort of opportunities she's taken up in terms of being able to talk about the book. But she really was one of the main inspirations for writing it. So she is a fantastic researcher and also was an organiser for the IWGB union, where she represented foster care workers and other members. And she had really huge insight into the organising struggles that those foster care workers were facing. And it also included this sort of interesting model of public-private ownership that is going to be one of the themes I'm going to talk about today. And she realized that there was also a kind of different struggle for her as well, which was that, or for her members, which is that the work that they were doing wasn't even often sort of recognized as work. You know, it was seen as kind of a, you know, benevolent caring, something that mostly women, you know, like to do with their spare time, and that it didn't need to be rewarded necessarily as work. So these are some of the themes that kind of inspired the book and that we discussed as we got going. But I thought it might be useful as well to just talk a bit in as part of these opening remarks about my own work history over the last decade, because I think it's brought hopefully a useful perspective on the topics we're going to be talking about today. So I've worked in public policy, so trying to sort of, you know, come up with policy ideas and influence government to change law. And that's the type of role I'm actually in now. But I have worked with and for trade unions before on strategic corporate research, is what it's sometimes called. So looking at the workings of companies and how their kind of corporate plans and their models might impact workers. And then separate to that, I've worked as an advisor to investors in the finance sector, which is something I never saw myself doing, working on behalf of institutional investors. So they were mostly pension funds, often local authority pension funds, sometimes trade union pension funds, actually. And they were investors who wanted to monitor the workforce and environmental impacts of their investments. So I sort of ended up with this triple perspective of, like, you know, what happens from the perspective of shareholders, what's going on from the perspective of workers and their unions, and then what's the role of government and policy in sort of regulating some of this. So hopefully that brings some useful insight to the conversation. And what I'm going to be talking about, or one of the big themes I'm talking about, is financialization. So it's a techie term. I don't know if it's always a useful term, but I will explain what it means, and then I'll probably leave it behind and we'll just talk about examples instead. But basically, as all of you know, finance and money is as old as capitalism itself. But financialization as a specific sort of process and era of finance and money can be understood as the increasing role of financial motives, actors, and institutions in the economy. And it's generally used to talk about the period since the 1980s, when the finance sector and its offshoots have sort of soared in value at a much faster rate than the real economy, so the parts of the economy where goods and services are being produced. And in sort of, I guess, less theoretical terms, what it means is we have a lot of businesses now being owned and run in ways that don't necessarily focus just on the value created by the workforce. So they're not just interested in how that workforce can produce things and deliver services, but they're also interested in making money in other ways. So one of the big ways of doing that is by acting like a landlord, so rent seeking, you know, looking to own properties, land, looking at whether the business itself could be speculated on as a way to bring in money. It's a kind of type of side hustling, I suppose, that businesses have been doing for a long time. And the reason we got interested in it is because of how this relates to work and the ability of workers to actually have a say over their working lives and to, you know, have a say over their wages, and how does it relate to the ability of unions to provide a kind of collective voice and collective vehicle for workers. So one example of a sort of highly financialized model that you might all be familiar with, or some of you might have heard of, is how this is played out in the care economy and the role specifically of private equity ownership. And I'll talk a bit about what that specifically is in a bit. But basically what's been going on is in the UK, the US, also across Europe, we've had care economy assets such as elderly care homes, children's homes, nurseries. They've sort of become big money makers for private equity owners. So if you read the corporate brochures of some of the companies that sort of sit behind these care chains, they will sound more like real estate development companies. You won't, you know, you'll wonder why they've got anything to do with care or childcare. So to think about elderly care as an example, lots of these private equity funds got involved because they saw it as a sector with big opportunities for property and land acquisition, because we've got an aging population. more of whom are going to need care in the coming years. So there's a kind of captive market there, huge demand. And there's also government subsidies to play for as well, because we know that the state generally has to prop up care somehow. You know, we generally use the tax system to subsidize care for people. So there's an income stream there. And so private equity firms saw this as a very lucrative kind of sector to get involved in. There were also big opportunities for buying up care home properties and land, and also building new properties and then selling them on, and then or even just leasing them back and having a rental income from them. So there are lots of ways that this sort of financialization has happened in the care sector. And the argument that we're making in the book is that those types of models really do complicate the work of unions in trying to organize workers. And I'll give some examples of how I think that happens and how I think things can be made harder. And also I'll talk about some of the opportunities that I think exist as well. So just to cover off what I mean by private equity, it basically just means a fund owned by private individuals rather than being publicly listed on the stock exchange. So it tends to be a small number of usually men with generally kind of from various international backgrounds who might have a kind of head office in London, and they will be buying up portfolio companies and then having various ways of sort of getting money out of those companies over time. And then they tend to sell them on. So they have big management fees. That's one way that they get money out of the company. They also often sort of make efficiencies, which is, you know, can include asset stripping, so selling on parts of the business. It can also often involve cutting jobs or trying to suppress the wage bill some other way. And then they tend to sell the company on after a few years. So Asda, Morrisons, you know, some of these household names that we all know are owned in this way now. And there's been a sort of increase in that type of ownership since the pandemic. Also lots of care companies and lots of other sectors as well. But I think it's interesting that this is quite common now in the kind of supermarket sector. So in terms of like the scale of the problem, just to give a sense of it, or, you know, not necessarily a problem, I think it's important to say that none of these models in and of themselves are inherently bad or, you know, better or worse than other forms of profit extraction, but they are different. And it's important to understand how they're different if we want to have any sort of democratic, you know, control or influence on them. So to give a sense of the scale, around 5% of the EU workforce work in private equity-backed companies. So that's 10.9 million people. So they're basically like uber big employers, really. They're kind of employing indirectly a huge portion of the workforce. In the UK, the portion's even bigger. So in 2023, there were 2.2 million UK workers in companies that are backed by private equity and their direct supply chains. So that's almost 10% of the UK's private sector workforce is in these companies. So it's not a niche issue. I know it sounds a bit niche and a bit sort of specific and technical, but it's a really common model now in the UK. So it is worth sort of, you know, getting to grips with it. So how does that change things for workers in those companies? A good friend of mine is a national organizer with the GMB, and she's represented Asda workers before and after their buyout by TDR Capital, which is a private equity company, a few years ago. So I've tested some of this thinking with her and sort of tried to gain some of her experiences as an organizer as well. So I'll just reel off a few ways that I think it's kind of these models have made things harder for unions. First, the models tend to make it difficult to work out who the actual boss of a company is. Who's actually calling the shots? Is it the owner of the fund, you know, one of that small number of individuals with the, you know, HQ in London, but who might live elsewhere? Or is it the investors who invest in that fund? And it's not always clear who they are. I'll talk a bit later about who some of them are. But it's not always obvious who those investors are. But, you know, these individuals that run private equity firms, they're not just investing their own money, they're investing other people's money as well to kind of buy up these companies. So is it them that we should think of as the boss? Or is it the managers who you might actually see kind of day to day or month on month in work, but who really don't have much decision making over anything because of this ownership structure above them? So it can be really hard to know who you're even negotiating with. Second, it can become hard to follow the money. So it's difficult to work out how much company profits actually exist, where the value in the company really sits, and that can make it really difficult to negotiate on wages. Sometimes what these companies are able to do is, I suppose one way to think of it is cry poor, so load themselves up with debt as a way to basically move money off the balance sheet, so it's harder for workers to bargain over it. So one study that I thought was particularly interesting found that companies facing a unionisation drive from the workforce actually tended to choose a higher debt to equity ratio. So they were using that as a kind of credible way of reducing the funds available to workers via wage bargaining. So basically shrinking the pie whilst extracting their own money through management fees. There's also evidence to show that private equity firms are more sensitive to wage pressures than other firms. So what that means is any perceived upward pressure on wages, so for example, from a union, private equity firms have been found to respond by shedding more jobs than would be the case in a comparison company in the same sector. So if we take supermarket as an example, one supermarket owned by a private equity firm would be more likely to cut the workforce if there was a feeling that wages were going to go up, whereas a supermarket not owned by private equity would look at other ways to deal with that increased wage bill. And those are both academic studies, based on rigorous research. And so the third way that I think these models can weaken the bargaining power of workforces is that they can provide fewer regulatory leverage points. So fewer ways to get government and the law and regulators involved, because they don't tend to be regulated in the same way as publicly listed companies. So there isn't a corporate governance code. They don't necessarily have public meetings or annual reports, or their kind of dealings are not scrutinized in the same way. So that can just make it more difficult to involve kind of other actors in your campaigns. So I think that's some of the challenges. And then I'll move on to some of the opportunities, or some of the ways. And I think it's really interesting. There are unions internationally that have been, tackling these issues. Unions here in the UK as well. And I think there's been some really kind of creative responses to these types of models. So one thing to think about in terms of opportunity is that, given the fact that money in these companies is not made just from the activities of workers, but it's also made from, rents and other activities, you could see that as resulting in a situation where workers have less leverage because, the company's making money in other ways. So why do workers have as much leverage there? But you can also see that as an opportunity to bring in a wider community of actors. So in care, there's a good example here, which is to look at who are the other people being potentially sort of exploited by this form of financial extraction. And I think with care, it's the care recipients and it's their families who are also losing out from these models. It's not just the workers. So another academic study found that during the pandemic, deaths in private equity-owned care homes were higher than in non-private equity care homes. And I think they were deaths among, that was counting deaths of the care recipients. But as we know, also care workers were experiencing the heightened risk of fatality due to COVID during the pandemic as well. So that's really damning evidence that basically shows in a very clear-cut way that when owners are busy financially engineering these companies and cutting costs and corners, care standards can slip. So I think organising those different groups and the different kind of actors who are affected by that is a really good place to start. And I know that Uni Global Union have done some really good campaigns trying to bring together care workers and care recipients across Europe and to educate them about private equity models as well. Another agent to try and bring in to the negotiations would be pension funds and other institutional investors. So you might remember earlier I mentioned that these funds aren't just individuals using their own money, they're drawing in money from other sources in order to buy out these companies. often the other sources they're bringing in money from are actually pension funds, local authority pension funds, sometimes trade union pension funds. And so strangely, indirectly, there are a group of workers who are standing to benefit from these investments down the line, but they usually won't know about it. And so learning about those interrelationships is really useful. And then finding out who those pension fund investors are and actually trying to make them aware of what's going on. And this is some of the work that I did during the pandemic when I was working as an advisor to investors. We were trying to bring together union representatives and institutional investors to have frank conversations about what was actually going on in companies and to see if those investors would actually support the union's campaign for improved standards. And often they would, because, you know, they saw those, you know, it aligned with their own values and their own interests. But it requires work to kind of bring those groups together, because you wouldn't usually see them as sitting on the same side of the table. And then the third and final sort of group to try and bring in, I would say, would be the workers in the other companies that your sort of Uber employer now sort of de facto is the employer for as well. So if you think about, you might have a private equity firm that owns a pub chain, a care home chain, and a garage. Can links and alliances be made between those different workforces? You know, you've sort of ended up with tens of thousands of new colleagues overnight, potentially, if another company gets bought out. And, you know, that's a daunting prospect, but it does also throw up opportunity maybe to make some links across. And I think that's where kind of public facing campaign work can be really effective. So my friend at the GMB, she's been doing organised demonstrations outside branches of Asda, bringing in Asda workers, mostly women, with those campaigns, but targeting national news, national media, national politicians and others to try and really raise awareness of the company that's sitting behind the ownership model. And they've also done a lot of work uncovering who those other companies are that private equity company owns as well. And I think that's an interesting way to start thinking about this. You know, are these actually just massive employers? Do we need to think of these other groups as our co-workers as well? And what interesting kind of collaboration could come from that? So I would say at the very least, exploring those is a useful education process for workers and unions to do anyway. So just trying to look for those links. I think in doing so, you learn a lot about the model itself. And then maybe just a kind of slightly different point to end on before we go into the conversation would be to think about how financialization might impact us all personally. So I've talked a lot there about how it changes business models and forms of ownership in the economy, but it also has impacts for us all personally, and that could have an impact for individuals' choices in terms of, you know, whether they organize through a union or something else. So to talk about what I mean, to sort of give an example of what I'm talking about here, I think it's useful to think of how common private renting is in the UK as a form of housing. So 1 in 5 UK homes are privately rented now. And so huge numbers of workers in the unions that, you know, are represented on this call will be living in privately rented housing where their landlord is probably the target for most of their sort of economic woes, more so than their boss, maybe. And that's because rents are rising almost twice as fast as wages at the moment. So if that's your situation, targeting your boss for more wages might feel fairly pointless because your landlord is going to take that pay rise up anyway in increased rents. So you might feel like the kind of issues that really motivate you are around rent controls and the welfare state. It might be that a renters union is something that really speaks to your interests and your needs to be represented. So I think there's a real sort of challenge and opportunity again for unions here in thinking about what they can offer in terms of that sort of whole person organising under this financialized model. And I know that loads of unions already do this, and in many ways it is the kind of history of labour organising anyway. You know, there have always been struggles over elements that go beyond literally work and wages. You know, it's always been a kind of broader movement with a broader set of issues. But I think it's interesting to think that through in the current sort of economic stage that we're in, where for a lot of people it's debt and it's the rent on their homes and it's the interest on their mortgage and it's all of these other kind of costs and extractions that probably light their fire as much as the fact that their wages have stagnated. So that's just maybe something to reflect on for all of us.
Thank you ever so much for that, Alice. I've been taking notes furiously whilst you've been chatting, so please don't think I was getting distracted on my phone or anything. I'm sat scrolling thinking, yes, that's a good idea. I need to think about that. We've got members that work in a supermarket that's owned by a private equity firm, so really, really key what you were saying. We have had a few questions, so I'm going to give you the ones online first before I do the Zoom ones. So we've had a couple of questions from Facebook. Do you want me to give you one at a time or a couple at once? How would you like to do it?
Yeah, maybe a couple at once, and I'll make some notes in case I forget it, and then I'll try and make sure I cover them all well.
All right, no worries. So the first one is, what's the role of finance workers in supporting workers organised disrupting capitalism? I like that question. And the second one is, what are your thoughts around the decline in the union movement post-pandemic? I know you've just spoke about kind of all-person organising and things, which I think is something that we definitely should be doing as a movement. But you know, it's a fact, isn't it, that we lost 220,000 union members generally in 2022 and only gained 89,000 despite the strikes, and a big chunk of those were women. And then a third one, before I go on to the ones on Zoom, how do we move beyond economic demands? Just little questions there, just light ones to get you started.
I'll solve it all. No, they're really good questions, and it's quite a variety as well, which is really interesting. Let me write the last one before I forget it. Okay, moving beyond economic demands. Yeah. Actually, before I answer them, whoever wrote that one about moving beyond economic demands, do you want to just explain in the chat what you meant by that? Because just so I can check that I'm going to answer that right. But I'll start by answering the other two. So the role of finance workers in supporting workers organising. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think, you know, in the last job that I mentioned where I was working in the finance sector, I was actually part of, you know, Unite Finance Workers branch, and it was a different branch for me to be in, and I was quite excited by that because I felt like it was a different group of workers for me to get to know, and also I felt there'd be lots of insights there in terms of just understanding what some of the experiences are for people on the shop floor in those sectors, and also in, you know, all different types of roles. I didn't really get to meet, partly because of the pandemic, I didn't get to meet with many of them. But I think what is interesting is just thinking through the sort of knowledge and the experiences that those workers will have from being employed in that sector, and thinking through how that could be useful as a form of, you know, skill sharing and knowledge sharing, and obviously not necessarily in relation to sensitive information or the type of information that they shouldn't be sharing, but just in terms of, you know, how some of these systems work, and I guess what the points of influence might be for some of them. And I think there are ways as well that, you know, if people are interested in learning more about that, but they don't necessarily want to go off and work in the finance sector, there are ways that you can do it through your own workplace as well. For example, if you're somewhere that's quite big, you could get involved in as a kind of pension trustee if you've got a workplace pension scheme. And through that, you'll have to learn all about kind of, you know, financial management, corporate governance, and what the role is of like stewarding those funds in a socially appropriate way. And I think that could offer really, really big insights. In terms of actually beyond kind of education, I think there are interesting examples of where you've had finance sector workers sort of build alliances with other groups of workers as well. But I think probably just that point of, yeah, helping to upskill and share knowledge is maybe an immediate place to start. And then
Before you jump on to the next one, Alice,
yeah,
so just it was a person on Facebook that had asked the question about economic demands.
yeah,
So they've added, how do we move towards worker control? That's what
okay,
the meme as beyond. Is
yeah,
that what the movement needs to do and build bolder, bigger new structures?
yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Um, well, I'll come to that now then, and then maybe we'll circle back to the one about declining membership. So I think so in the book, we dedicate the last chapter to thinking about how to definancialize the economy, because ultimately, you know, all the examples I gave when I was talking just now were about ways to try and apply the union model to these different forms of ownership and try and, you know, still protect jobs and win wage increases, etc. But I guess a more fundamental thing to aim for would be to actually reduce the power of finance in determining, you know, elements of our lives. And so for that, I think public and worker ownership are the kind of necessary models or antidotes to financialized models. But how to get there is a difficult question. I guess there is in the UK, there is a slight uptick, I think, in interest in public ownership models, and there are some signs from the government that it would be interested in nationalising certain sectors. But I think there's also a school of thought that we shouldn't be trying to return to kind of national models of ownership of the past, but we should be looking at more maybe more democratic, less hierarchical models of ownership that would give workers more control and give them a greater say in sort of how that organisation is run. So I think worker ownership and worker ownership as part of cooperative models is a really interesting area. And I think one that again has a good amount of energy behind it. But there are also maybe slightly less interesting models that exist that are sort of halfway houses, I guess. So where workers are given more control over private companies. So that might be through putting workers on the board. That might be through having workers own part of the company as share owners. And I think there are good and bad versions of this. I did see recently, actually, in an article in the Financial Times that showed there was a private equity company that was actually giving workers shares in its portfolio companies, and it was, you know, presenting this as a really positive thing, and it is like, you know, those workers are going to do well out of it, but it's not transforming the model itself. So there's probably a limited amount of actual worker control that comes with the ownership of those shares. But I do think that kind of involving workers more in corporate governance is a really interesting and kind of valuable area to explore. And there are a lot of institutional investors, so lots of pension funds that support that model as well, because they see that actually having workers more involved in decisions is good for the company overall. You know, it's good for the long-term viability of the company. So I think that could be an area that maybe has some progress in the years ahead. And then finally, on the question of losing members, yeah, I don't know. I'll probably turn to you on that one, Sarah, because it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think before the pandemic, I was definitely feeling like there was a kind of uplift in the union movement in terms of membership and energy, and obviously there's been brilliant industrial action since, and there's been very visible wins in some areas of the economy. But the fact that membership, you know, hasn't recovered is obviously an issue. I didn't know that a lot of the loss was women members. So yeah, I'd be interested in your reflections on that one, Sarah.
Probably get myself into trouble if I were too honest. I do think, you know, pandemic, cost of living crisis does you know, people have had their earnings shrunk and all sorts, and disproportionately women working disproportionately part-time 0 hours contracts, you know, what gives, and sometimes it's the union membership, especially if they don't feel that the union's representing them. And that's why, you know, when you talked about whole member organising, there's a mantra that I've had for years. Your issues don't start and stop at the workplace door, do they? And if we can solve and support and and kind of make something easier outside of work, the issues that you've got inside of work don't quite feel quite as big, do they? But it's not about me tonight, it's about you and listening to you. We've had loads of questions that have come in from on the Zoom. They started kind of as you started answering the first ones, they started trickling in. So I'll just go down them.
Okay.
Some of them haven't got clear names on, so if they haven't got a clear name, I'm not going to say who it is. I hope that's okay. Civitas is a great example of a REIT, REIT, with a complicit structure that prevents unionisation. How do you see unions working with complex ones of them that hide behind multi-layered employment structures? Do you want
Yeah,
a couple again or just one?
I'll go. I can go for that one first. So
Okay.
I think, yeah, I think REITs are a model that are very connected to what we've been talking about tonight. So that is where it's a kind of financial model set up for property investment primarily. So real estate investment trust is what it stands for, and it's something that has been a big area of investment for pension funds, as I mentioned earlier. And because there's big profits to be made. There's big profits to be made in property and in technology as well is a kind of another area. But I think in relation to REITs, I think understanding who the investors are that are investing in the model is a useful start. And you can get that stuff in the public realm. It can just be quite dense to work through. But there are various, I think guides out there and organizations that can offer support on this type of thing. But I think that is a really good starting point, understanding whose money's actually gone into this REIT and who's going to be gaining from it. But I think in relation to how that impacts work and employment conditions, I think it's in some cases, looking for regulatory levers. They do exist for some sectors. So even though I was talking about how problematic things are in the care sector, that is a regulated sector here in the UK. There are a minimum, there's kind of staffing requirement level that is, governed. And these companies, whoever they are, do have to meet those regulations. So I think looking for those kind of policy levers and regulatory hooks that you can try and get these sort of models and funds on the hook for, I think is a way to go as well. But yeah, I'd be interested in hearing more in the chat actually from that person in terms of what their struggles have been.
Thanks, Alice. There's a couple around education, so I'll ask them together if that's all right, just looking at the time. So there's Lucy says, I'm a teacher in early years, so I was interested in your examples relating to the care sector and childcare. Do you see any parallels to the education sector and how it is being privatised via academy trusts and how we push back against this privatisation? How do we increase union membership in early years sector? And a linked one to that is, are you aware of private equity firms investing in +16 education at all? Probably higher education rather than further education, but not necessarily.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of that in further or higher education so much. No. So that I'd be interested to know more. I definitely am aware of it in early years and nurseries. And this is something I've spent some time in the past thinking about, partly because I'm a user of childcare. I've got 2 kids. So, one of them's in a nursery now, the other one's now in school. And I've always just found it baffling that I can be paying so much of my wages to these nurseries, and yet the nursery workers are on, awful wages. Where's the money going? And it is often the case that that it's these private equity companies sitting behind it, not in the ones that I've been involved in as it happens, but that a lot of the money in the cases where I've been involved has actually just gone on the property costs. So just the rents that those nurseries are having to pay. And that is another form of financialization. It's one we're all more familiar with, and for those of us who are in private renting or have privately rented themselves, that sort of landlordism exists for companies and organizations as well. So there will be nurseries, sometimes there'll be charities who are having to pay these high rents to landlords. So I think that's something that has a downward pressure on wages for sure. And I think something that's really interesting in nurseries is that there's so little sort of progression and professionalisation in the sector, that it means you have nursery managers who are often earning not much more than the nursery workers themselves, and yet are responsible for, making sure the nursery is, going to pass its Ofsted well, making sure they're not understaffed, making sure that all the parents are happy. And, that's a hard crowd to please as a as a parent myself. We're quite needy, when it comes to our little darlings. You all want to know that they're all being looked after brilliantly. But it's like something has to give in that model, something has to give. And I think it's a sector really ripe for union organising, but I know that it's difficult and it's been difficult. There are really good examples from abroad, actually. I think Germany has some fantastic childcare worker action, which I'm sure Lucy, who asked the question, knows about. And also there's a really interesting example in Australia that kind of connects this history of financialisation a bit to worker organising, which is that there was a nursery chain there called ABC, I think it was called, back in the early 2000s, that was bought up by a private equity firm and grew rapidly across the country, sort of building new nurseries, acquiring nurseries. It was this kind of had this huge burst of growth. And I think I'm right in saying the owner became like the wealthiest person in Australia. It was, a big windfall for him. And it crumbled. It was built on a house of cards, and overnight there were closures across the country, and nurseries just basically shut their doors and said, you can't let your kids come today because we've crashed. The chain has crashed because it had gone so much into debt and blah blah blah, as happens. But what was really interesting, if you think about that, is that if you close the doors of a nursery and don't let the kids come in, you are impacting the working lives of, hundreds of thousands of other people who were relying on childcare to go to work in their jobs. So there's this real interesting sort of chain of ripple effect of impacts, which could be used as leverage if you think about it, because, a strike of nursery workers is very effective at actually bringing down other sectors or other sort of areas of the economy if it's done in a coordinated way. And so I think it's an interesting challenge to try and think through. And what was interesting in that model is that after those closures, there was actually a move towards cooperative ownership. And I don't know if it really took hold, but there was worker organising to try and basically take over. So I think in the sort of medium term, the nurseries got taken in by the state, because basically the state recognised that someone had to keep the doors open because of the wider economic effects. So there was a kind of momentary nationalisation of this nursery chain. And then I think there was a move to try and put some of it into sort of worker-led cooperative hands. And I don't know if that kind of succeeded. But it's an interesting model of where, the private sector, highly kind of indebted model fails, and then how does the rest of the economy have to respond? And in a way, you could think about those potential crises down the line in some of the sectors we've been talking about here in the UK as opportunities to try and, bring in a new model of ownership in those cases as well.
I'm all for worker cooperatives as long as they're unionised.
Yeah.
So we've still got a few to go through. So Paul says many of these workplaces won't be unionised. Do you think the new access rights for trade unions in the employment bill will help?
Yeah, so in my current job, I've been doing a lot of work looking at the employment rights bill and being sort of involved in some of the conversations around it, as you do when you're working in research and policy. And I do think on the industrial relations side of things, there are some positive changes that are going to happen, one being access. And again, I defer to others on the call who are, experiencing this type of thing day in, day out through their own unions. But I do think if this is done well, then it could have a really positive impact on boosting membership, because basically what's being proposed is that, you know, there could be a right of access for unions in all workplaces, and that there'd be some kind of digital equivalent as well, which I think is an interesting idea. If it's an employer that does a lot of its kind of organising and administration online, which a lot of employers do. I mean, Sarah, you'll know more than me about McDonald's, but I know that it's often the case for workers in food and restaurant chains, that they actually, you know, don't get to speak to a human or interact with a human for a long time when they're actually applying for a job. You know, you're sort of interviewed by bots, you're on an intranet system, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so I think having a kind of digital presence for unions in that journey, I think could be really, really beneficial. And then also the physical presence as well. I can't quite imagine how it's going to work, because I think workplaces are so, or like private sector workplaces in particular, are so shut off to that idea now, that I can imagine it's going to be, you know, a tense one to implement, and probably one that's at risk of being watered down, because the bill is very much just a draft, isn't it? It's going to have months of consultation, and the consultation on that element has actually just opened. So for anyone interested, keep an eye on that and respond. I think the deadline is early December. And there are other changes obviously proposed in the bill that I think will benefit worker organising. So again, there has been watering down that's happened, but the right to contracted hours that reflect your actual working pattern, I think, is significant. I think that will give more workers an opportunity to understand their rights at an earlier point, and maybe to look for support from colleagues, and maybe build a bit of a collective voice around what that kind of process should look like. So yeah, I think there are good things in the Employment Rights Bill. It feels like it's already getting into quite a technical stage, but I think it is good to sometimes just step back and acknowledge that these are generally quite positive moves compared to what we've had for the last decade, which is either nothing or bad changes. Like the whole time I've been working on employment rights policy, there's just been very little policy to even scrutinise. So at least there is now something.
That is true. That is true. Okay, so we've got 6 questions.
Okay.
I think we've got plenty of time to get through them.
Cool.
Nige says, brilliant presentation, Alice, which I completely concur. How do we best forge those alliances between workers who find themselves with the same boss, setting out shared injustice, community campaigning, sharing success stories? They're not making it easy to fly through these questions because they're quite deep, aren't they?
Yeah, I do think that's a good question, though. I think it's about looking for commonalities across them. So it can be hard, I think, when workers are in completely different sectors to really think about what's the same. But I think often what's the same, particularly if it's the same private equity owner, will be that probably the wages and models of working are quite similar. They're probably at the lower end. You know, it will be people on insecure contracts. It will be people with temporary contracts and hired through agencies, etc. So I think looking for those commonalities across your employment model, I think, would be a good place to start. And then I think it's about doing the research. It's about finding out, you know, who these other workforces are, and you can do that. So I mean, private equity companies are known for being sort of mysterious and hidden, and, you know, even the Financial Times journalists write reams and reams trying to, you know, unpick the different models and write about how kind of shady and hidden some of the models are. But there is information out there. You can generally go on the website of a private equity firm and look at its portfolio companies, and you'll recognize the logos there for, you know, the companies, the brands that you recognize, but there'll be others that you don't recognize. But it might be that once you go on it, you realize that that's just a supplier for a company you do recognize, you know. It might be that one is like a logistics company that operates alongside a supermarket that you know, or, you know, another company that you know. So I think it's about looking for recognition of the different companies, and then in terms of actually reaching out and finding those workforces, I mean, I guess looking for if they're already unionized. But but also doing that kind of public facing campaign work to draw attention to it. And I don't know whether the friend that I was mentioning who organises with the GMB and ASDA workers there, I don't know whether their public coverage has helped them make any of those links across workforces. I'll have to ask her, but she's managed to get onto like Good Morning Britain talking about private equity companies. So, you know, she's had decent success with it. I should name her actually, Nadine Horton at the GMB. I'm sure many of you know her. But yeah, she's doing really great work, and it's worth just Googling some of the stuff she's been up to actually, because I think that's some really good examples of campaigns that you can try.
Brilliant. We need to be better as a movement sharing those best and good examples. I'm going to ask the next two together because they're kind of similar. So the biggest mutual funds like BlackRock and Vanguard own tens of trillions between them, and their political influence in this country is just as powerful as their financial influence. How can the trade union movement as a whole combat this seemingly overwhelming force? And then to add on to that, because I do think they're quite similar, the shifts in ownerships you've talked about clearly lend themselves to wider leverage strategies for national unions and even large regions and branches. What do you think the implications are for workplace activists and smaller collectives of workers trying to organise their workplace? Loosely linked, but kind of.
Yeah, I think they're both really good questions. So I'd say on the first, in terms of the financial influence and the political influence of some of these big players, yeah, basically some of those companies that you mentioned do own, you know, swathes of companies, or they co-own swathes of companies here in the UK, and abroad, and they have a huge amount of power, as you say. I think I don't think I'd be able to answer how we kind of overcome that, other than saying that, again, it does tend to be, there are forms of, you know, public and pension fund money wrapped up in them as well. And there have been regulatory changes recently in the UK that mean that even when a pension fund's invested in one of these big sort of asset managers like a BlackRock or whoever, that pension fund that's invested through them is able to split off their votes and actually vote themselves on how their money's spent. And there's a few pension funds now sort of starting to do this as a way to basically try and take back a little bit of control over their own funds, rather than just allowing the likes of BlackRock to invest it all on their behalf. And I think that's something for unions to be aware of, because it creates another point of influence, you know, finding out who those pension funds are who are getting their own vote, basically, and trying to build alliances there. So there's a really good organisation that I used to work for, which is called Pensions and Investments Research Consultants. And they do a lot of really interesting work in trying to make democratic ownership a bit more possible for investors. So they try to make it easier for responsible investors to actually vote and participate in decisions in ways that align with their own principles and values. And they do a lot on workers' rights and sort of, you know, how to make sure that as a pension fund steward, you're not directly involved in investing in ways that sort of exploit workers. So I think looking for organizations like that in the US, there's a lot. There's a coalition called the Committee for Workers' Capital, and they do a lot of work with unions and others to basically try and bring together those different power bases of local authority pension funds, unions, and they try and, you know, build campaigns between them. They've got some really good resources online for how you can kind of do some of this. And then on the other question, which was about the fact that some of this lends itself to national level kind of leverage strategies and research, and what do you do as a small organizer or in a small workplace? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I think it does lend itself to, you know, having these well-funded kind of corporate research teams set up as part of, you know, leverage functions within a national union, and it's good that some unions have that. But I do think there's a role for other organisers and for smaller groups as well, because I think a lot of this is honestly just knowing what to Google. and knowing how to cause as much, or to sort of gain as much information and to have as much impact with the information that you've found as possible. And I don't think that necessarily needs like a huge coordinated national project. The IWGB as a small union are quite good at doing this, even though they've only got, you know, not a huge number of staffers there. But I think, yeah, in terms of what you can actually then do at your own, at the level of your own workplace, I think it's trying to push for a kind of information balance. So trying to understand what information it is you need, and pushing for that, and using your position as a union rep to actually push for that, push for more transparency, and bringing people in more, I guess, to your negotiations within your own workplace. An idea I've had, or I didn't have it, but I've heard others talk about that I always think is really cool, is if you've not got many people in your own union meeting, but you want to feel that you've got more, other ways that you can use Google Docs to basically live type the outcomes of the meeting. If there's a kind of wider community, maybe across the country, of people who do care about what you're doing, maybe they're in a similar organization or whatever, can you try and bring them in virtually to the meeting, not through a Zoom, but actually just having shared Google documents with your notes, where you're kind of seeing what's actually going on in your negotiations. And I think that's quite an interesting way of kind of building out that support. And then one final thing I guess I'd say on that is that often private equity companies, in their portfolios, the companies that they own will have a similar geographic basis. So there are some that seem to mostly want to buy up supermarkets or garages in the northwest or whatever. So often, if you look, there might actually be sort of geographic alignment of some of those other workforces, and that could be a starting point for building collaboration.
Thank you. Have we got time for 3 quick questions? We can do it, can't we?
Let's see. I'll just do quick answers.
Okay, so one of them will be very quick. Will there be some analysis on what union-specific strategies work in terms of systematically building workers' organisations in the face of the economic challenges you've described tonight?
I don't know, but it sounds like a good idea.
That is quick, yeah, I like that. But that was a simple question in the grand scheme of the questions that have been asked.
Yeah.
Callum's saying huge problem in social care, private providers, community care and residential nursing, placements for children, are sucking local authorities dry, consuming public funds, keeping care workers' wages low, exploitation, they're getting away with corporate neglect and manslaughter. What do you think prevents the government addressing this?
I think that's a really tricky one. It's a good question because, you know, as more money goes into the sector, it's just getting taken out. It's the kind of leaky bucket analogy of like, we all know social care is underfunded, but the more funding that goes in, it doesn't go to the right places. So I think it's a really difficult conundrum. I mean, the obvious thing to do is to nationalise more of it, or to have more care workers directly employed by local governments, because then you actually know that if you're boosting their wages, it's going on their wages and it's going on the staffing levels, because you're in control of it. Whereas if that money is having to go around via private companies, it might be that wages go up, but they find ways to, I don't know, cut staff to save their costs that way. So I think probably having more of it in national control makes sense. And I think a lot of people probably agree with that. But in terms of how to make it happen, I don't know.
Fair enough. And last, but by no means least, is there an inevitable contradiction between democracy and the kind of financialised models you've discussed? If so, how do workers include democratic demands within workplace organising, and can this be linked to wider political campaigns and demands? I think you might have touched on this, but...
Yeah, again, that's a brilliant question. And I think there is a contradiction for sure. And there are ways you can build democracy into the models, but I think the contradiction will remain for sure. Yeah, in terms of what they can push for, yes, I think having more democratic rights over how, you know, decisions are made is something that can be pushed for. A lot of it gets very technical, and so it's maybe a bit hard to campaign around. But I think it's a good principle to aim for sure.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions and me firing them at you and getting through an hour of chatting with me. I know you can't see people clapping, but I absolutely know they're sat behind the screens clapping and applauding because that's just been an amazing session and a wonderful continuation of this series. And I'm just going to do a shameless plug before we close because one of the other caps that I wear and GFTUs involved in is an organisation called Organise Now. And we're
Mm.
about to embark on an organising campaign with Gales, which, for those that don't know, is the really posh, bougie cafe chain that's not at all like Greg's, but very similar down south. Although there is some in Manchester and Sheffield now. But we've done a lot of research around how they're funded because the company's split and there is, private equity at one side as well as the other. So it'd be if you are on this call and you're interested in kind of doing some organising and getting involved, we've got a couple of calls coming up next week around how we're going to do an organising campaign next month and try and get some members empowered and unionised and organised in Gales, and the links now in the chat. Before I let you all go, two quick announcements. Please make sure if you've enjoyed this as much as I have, please make sure you register before the 5th of November for our next instalment of the strategy series, where we'll be joined on the 19th of November by Harry Han to discuss strategies for activists development. So it moves nicely on from the discussion that we've had tonight. And if you want more of this stuff, please do become a friend of the GFTU. You can donate, I donate £25 a month, and I know that that's going towards more people being able to access the fantastic education that we've had tonight, the reps courses, the residential courses. We do young members development weekends and all sorts through the GFTU, because what we know is we need activists. The movement's not going to grow if we don't have people that know our history, can strategize and build and grow and make our lives, our workplaces and our communities a better place. So become a friend of the GFTU, sign up for the next series. And thank you so much again, Alice, for spending an hour of your evening talking to me and all the other people that are watching. I've learnt a lot. I've got lots of notes and lots of to-do lists. And I'm sure everybody else has as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for having me, everyone.